This is Connected Games Research, a series of lectures from leading scholars from around the world who study digital games from a wide range of disciplinary perspectives.
Hello, I'm Joseph DeLappe. You're about to view a lecture regarding my creative practice. I wanted to put together this short introduction just so you had a face to go with the work, as I'm not there to share my work with you in person. I'm an American. I live in Dundee, Scotland. I moved over here about 4 years ago. I'm born and raised San Francisco, California. I went to San Jose State University to study graphic design in my 20s and eventually found myself in a really interesting experimental program engaging media arts and creative practice. I'm definitely not involved in the commercial arts field, game design, that kind of thing. I do mostly experimental work, which you'll see here in a moment, but I just wanted to say thanks for the opportunity to share my work, and if you ever have any questions or want to contact me about my work, I do believe you'll see my email address on the last slide, or at least my website address, and you can contact me from there. So thanks very much, and hope you enjoy the lecture.
Hello, my name is Joseph DeLappe. I'm the professor of games and tactical media from Abertay University. I'm going to give you a lecture today called Headshot: Resistance, Memory, and Play. This will detail my work and working history in utilizing video games in my practice as a creative artist. Now, I'm definitely not a digital native. I'm 57 years old. I began engaging computer games for the first time probably in the late 1970s. I recall a friend having an original Pong setup that we played in his basement. In the 80s, I played some computer games, mostly on a kind of arcade style situations. This was the game Battlezone, which was a very early kind of tank warfare game. Also played the very popular Star Wars game TIE Fighter, which was really, really fun and very, very sort of low-res graphics. I had gone to see the original Star Wars in 1977 as a 13-year-old, so I was really quite excited to be able to play this game. Although you have to remember these all cost money, so that it was limited the amount of time I would play these games during this time frame. I probably really got into computer games in the 1990s. In the mid-90s, I was running a computer lab at the University of Nevada, Reno, where I was the head of the digital media program. And this was a time we had a laboratory that was all Apple Macintosh systems. This was before Apple became the juggernaut it is today. There were no Apple stores, that kind of thing. So when you would order equipment, you would use these magazines and order what you needed. They would come delivered to the lab, and what I found was this particular catalog-based company would send you what you ordered, but they would also insert CD-ROMs of kind of slightly out-of-date computer games. And one of them that we received was this one, which was Marathon by Bungie. This was really quite a revelation. It was the first one of the earliest first-person shooter games where you could sort of navigate around a three-dimensional space and shoot at enemies, and it's a survival game, a first-person shooter. And I was completely absorbed with this. It was just quite an amazing experience, and this led to a kind of interaction with computer games, just for fun, just for kind of guilty pleasure. But of course, as with most things, as a visual artist, the things that you explore and are interested in eventually can become central to what you do as an artist. So yeah, another game that at the time really I found interesting was a update to X-Wing to TIE Fighter. This is X-Wing versus TIE Fighter, which was playing on my Macintosh, and just really enjoyed this game. Was playing with a joystick, and this became kind of central to the first work I did as an artwork. This was part of a larger series, the Mouse series, and this came about from running these computer labs, and at the time using these early desktop interface devices. They had the little trackball inside, and they would get all dirty and gummed up, especially when you had 30 students using one mouse and constantly, and they would be breaking, and when they're dead, when they no longer work, what do you do with them? And there was no way to recycle them. Putting them in the trash just seemed kind of a horrible thing to me, and so I started saving these, and then started turning them into sculptures. This is actually a physical sculpture called the Heart Mouse, and it was created from two Apple desktop mice. I have these model building skills from when I was a youth and used to create kind of award-winning kind of military miniatures and dioramas and that sort of thing. So I created this, and eventually I gave this as a gift to my college roommate who married the woman he met on the internet in the late 90s. Seemed an appropriate thing. They've got it hanging in their living room. So yeah, this mouse series kind of expanded to create a whole number of works that addressed desktop interface technology in a creative way. These are various iterations of that. You have the joystick ball, you have the Genesis game controllers put together on the bottom, and then you have a whole series of Microsoft mice and the resulting kind of removed mouse balls that are shown as sculptures. Probably the largest works from this series. This is called the Mouse Mandala, and many of these mice came from these computer labs that I worked at, but many more of them, the majority of them, came from a shop in Silicon Valley called Weird Stuff Warehouse. And if you can imagine, like one of your largest shopping experiences, it was a warehouse full of discards from the Silicon Valley industries. And I would go there and I would buy boxes of dead, used computer mice for pennies on the dollar. And I still have many boxes of these. And this piece specifically was physically weaving these together into a larger sculpture as a kind of faux religious kind of icon. I was also really interested in weaving as a kind of tribute to the Luddites from 19th century United Kingdom. This was a fairly massive uprising against the Industrial Revolution, which involved the largest mobilization of UK military forces on their own soil against their own citizens. And so these, all of these mice, they're dirty, they're used, they all come from this sort of history of work in kind of cubicle cultures in Silicon Valley. So this was kind of just a way of kind of creating in a way, sort of a memorial and a kind of remembrance about the history of these devices and the people who use them and this new kind of era of work. I realize these past works really are not specifically related to video games, but they do lead in, and this is kind of the work that is kind of the pivot point. I created this work, which is called my Artist Mouse, and it's essentially this is the only functional mouse from the mouse series, and this is my actual desktop mouse that I would use in everyday work on my computer and play. So I created this appendage that I would attach to my mouse and allowed me to connect pencil, brushes, etc. And so the Artist Mouse. And so you make this. I made this thing and I was like, okay, what am I going to do with it? Well, at the time I made this device, the Artist Mouse, I was playing this game, Unreal. This was the original iteration of this very popular shooter game, and this was, of course, a first-person shooter. It was not playable across the internet. So I thought, what's going to make interesting marks with this Artist Mouse, this strange invention? And I thought, okay, playing a shooter game, definitely my mouse is constantly in motion in a way that is not otherwise. So I connected the mouse up to the system, and I played some rounds. And so what you see here, this is the result. I replaced my mouse pad with 10 by 10 inch pieces of fine arts rag paper and proceeded to play levels of the game. And each level resulted in one of these drawings. This was an experiment. These were drawings that I would not be able to do if I tried otherwise. And you can consider these kind of a direct mapping of play, of the kind of physical interaction with the digital system to play this game. And you could trace back those marks to kind of relive in a way conceptually the playing of Unreal. So this discovery, this experiment led to a whole series of works where I utilized this device to essentially record all of my computer time, whether I was playing or whether I was working. So this includes the one on the left, which I made at my desk at the university when I was department chair. So it's rather boring doing kind of memorandums and communicating via email and running the department where I worked. The ones on the bottom right, those are called work play. Each of those represents about a month of all of my computer time. These were made at home, so a lot of this was play, but it was also work. And again, these are kind of a mapping using mouse movement to create these marks. And there's also I think a curious kind of shift from analog to digital. Here I am using very traditional art making tools and trying to combine these in a creative way with these new digital devices. I suspect you'll see that quite a bit in my work as things go. This work to engage creatively in computer games, which really kind of started with those sculptures and the mouse drawings, eventually evolved as I started playing other games, particularly when they began to be available to play on the internet. So early iterations of Quake, that type of thing, allowed a communication with other players via your keyboard. And I thought, wow, that's quite interesting and also a bit anachronistic when you think about that you're in this amazing virtual 3D space running around killing each other, but you have to stop and interact via this 19th century invention of the keyboard to be able to communicate with each other beyond killing the other player. So I thought, and I began to look at these online environments, these game spaces, these gaming maps, both as a kind of theater like environment, but also as a new type of public space, a new type of public commons. And I thought to myself, okay, so why do I have to go in this space and participate in this prescribed mayhem of killing other players? Why couldn't I do other things? Why couldn't I do what contemporary artists have done for quite some time, which is to think differently about the environments we exist in? So I tried an experiment. I went into this Star Trek Elite Force Voyager game online, and my avatar's name became Allen Ginsberg, the very famous American beat poet. And instead of playing the game, I was a neutral kind of visitor, and I would stand in place and I would use the keyboard and I typed for 3 hours to input in its entirety his very famous poem called Howl. Now this was a kind of ridiculous gesture. This was fun, it was strange. I had no idea whether this was interesting or significant. Turns out this was one of the first instances of an artist doing a kind of interventionist performance in a shooter game. You can see another screenshot there, and by Allen Ginsberg typing words from Allen's Ginsberg's poem. To the right, that was my setup. So I was projecting my point of view and typing from the book. So that first experiment led to a number of other approaches to engaging game space as performative space, right? So I had this idea, and I approached 5 of my students in my digital media program who were gamers, and I invited them to join me in forming a temporary performance troupe. And what we did was essentially each of us went into the Quake 3 Arena game online to the same server. Each of us has one of the characters from the TV show Friends. And I had to transcribe word for word from watching an episode of Friends, an entire episode, and we proceeded to recreate that, to reenact that episode online in Quake. This was rather insane. We did a first version in the lab at my university, and then we decided to recreate this second version that we did full on in the gallery space at the university. So we had all 6 points of view, one for each character, Rachel, Chandler, Joey, Ross, etc., being projected. And we sat in front of our computers, each reading aloud, so that when we were typing and reading, it sounded really kind of like this, right? Very sort of stilted kind of delivery. But then you had these 12 channels of sound coming from the game. So it was this explosive kind of chaotic mixing of kind of cultural reference, if you will. It was really quite an extraordinary experience. One of the curious things that happened with this, the project was reported in the New York Times a few days before the actual performance, which was really thrilling as an artist to have that kind of international attention to the work. Well, that also drew the attention of the legal team from Warner Brothers Television, who contacted me and threatened lawsuits against the university and myself over the use of their copyrighted material. Well, in the US, you actually have basic protections for free speech that allow you to utilize cultural material for critique and satire and for kind of creative artistic purposes. So I pushed back against that and went on with the performance, but it was quite intriguing to know that the producers of the show and the company behind Friends had actually known about the work. Now, it was really around this time that I found myself getting to be further politicized as an artist. So you see, Quake Friends was in 2003. It was 2000. It was in the same era, same time frame that the United States decided to invade Iraq under false pretenses, as if Saddam Hussein had something to do with the attacks of 9/11. On July 4th, 2002, the U.S. military released this game called America's Army. If you don't know about this game, this is actually remains one of the 10 most popular freely downloadable games in the world. It was created as a recruiting and marketing tool for the U.S. military. They were having a difficult time achieving, filling their ranks for these various wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And this was something that was actually started before, they started developing this before 9/11, but it became very, very important and significant in terms of being able to draw young people into the army. Of course, in the United States, you have an all-voluntary military. So this game had come out. I remember this was being announced. I'd done these other kind of performance works in game spaces, and I thought, wow, this is a serious game, and something needs to happen in this eventually. Well, that time had come. So what I decided to do was essentially, okay, they're trying to recruit young people into the U.S. military using this virtual game. What if I intervened in that space? What if I went into that space? My avatar is called Dead in Iraq, and rather than play the game, I would type in the names, age, service branch, and date of death of each American casualty from the war.
Ricardo X. Rodriguez 23 Army October 4th 2007. ARCHA and the 26th Army, October 5th, 2007.
Now, you can see from the video that the reactions from the other players were tended to be very negative, and they're very upset by what I was doing. There would oftentimes be these typed back replies to my input of the names, RIP, this is a game, to this type of thing, dead, please is not the forum to do this, I don't give a fuck, man, will all the hackers go play ping pong or something? Generally, the other players were not happy about what I was doing here. And ultimately, I would often get kicked from various game sessions. And to me, that was a kind of victory. That meant all the players had seen what I was doing. And it took all the players, it had to be a majority vote, complete majority vote for me to be kicked from the match. This was okay. My intentions here were both to create a kind of digital memorial to these soldiers, if you will, this kind of this fleeting roll call of their names as if they had been carved into granite on a sculpture, but in this instance in the digital space. So it would show up and then it would scroll away and then the next would come. Meant as a sort of poetic kind of reflection of our era and the horrible situation where nearly 5,000 young Americans had been killed in that war. And it was also meant as a type of protest, a way of kind of calling attention to the fact that, you're playing this free game online, oh, isn't it fun? But really you're engaging in a kind of military propagandistic space created by the US government for purposes other than you having fun. I wanted to really sort of close that loop between what was virtual military territory and the very real destruction and death that was going on the other side of the world. Now I'm going to jump into some very different work here, but it has a direct connection to the Dead in Iraq project. One of the things that happened when I was making that work is it drew quite a bit of press attention, and there were articles in Wired magazine, Salon.com, got interviewed on National Public Radio in the States, CNN international and national. And oftentimes in the publication of these written stories in particular, there would be very, very active comment sections with people really angry, and, saying they wanted to come break my legs and that kind of thing. And, I decided to kind of engage in those spaces. So I would oftentimes log into those particular publications and using my real name and saying, I'm the one making this and here's why. And often I would get into these sort of back and forth dialogues with people who were really, really angry about the work that I was doing. In one of these instances, there was an individual who said, dude, you got a Gandhi complex, which, was kind of made me giggle, but I was also like, wow, so you think being like Gandhi is somehow a negative? It's like, okay. And I took that to heart and I was like, okay, maybe what if I became Gandhi? So I had some ideas previously about other kinds of performances in game spaces, one of which might be a walk across computer space, right? What if you just went exploring? And so that kind of led to this, and that comment from that other player led to this ideation, this idea of what about Gandhi's Salt March in India in 1930. Gandhi walked 240 miles over 26 days across India, eventually having thousands of followers, and this was to collect salt on the beach at Dandi as a protest against British imperialism and control of all the resources in India. It was in fact illegal for him to collect that salt because the British owned it. So I took this idea and created an avatar in Second Life called M. Gandhi. M. Gandhi became central to this larger performance work that involved recreating the Salt March in Second Life. So what I did was, well, essentially I proposed this to a residency program in New York City at I-Beam Art and Technology as a project. And I was awarded a commissioned residency, which allowed me to go to New York for 6 months and create this project. What I did was I adapted a Nordic track walk fit treadmill to become a game controller. And my steps on the treadmill became Gandhi's steps in Second Life. And if you don't know Second Life, look it up. It was a very active online world that was released about the same time Facebook came into being. Many people thought Second Life was going to be this behemoth that would kind of change social interactions forever, which is what Facebook did. But this became a kind of a genre, sort of a bit of a smaller impact, but still, it is still an active space. 17 years later, there are still thousands of people interacting in this space as I speak. So I set up this treadmill and I proceeded to walk, and essentially walked about 8 to 10 miles per day. And of course, a big part of this was interacting with the other residents of this space. And eventually I would walk up to people and they would say, "Hey, Gandhi, what's up?" And I'd tell them, "Oh, my human's on a treadmill. We're walking 240 miles, reenacting my salt march. Would you care to join us?" And I would give people a gift of my walking stick. And oftentimes I had, up to a dozen followers walking with me and chatting. And, it was a really joyful experience. And also quite transformative. I went into this as a kind of conceptual performance and thinking of New York City and all of the performance artworks that had gone on there for decades. And wow, this is an opportunity to do something really interesting in this context. But what I found was that I was really affected by this work. Not only did I lose about 8 pounds from the walking, but I found myself immersed in this experience to the point where when I would be I would basically walk all day at the installation space, public gallery space at I-Beam. And I would walk back to my apartment in the East Village, and I would think I could click on people, or I would have these sudden, deja vu points where I would be going down the subway stairs and all of a sudden I was in a space in Second Life in my mind's eye. But I was literally living and breathing this experience. It was all I did for a month. And to talk about immersive experiences, this was definitely one. And honestly, after my experience with Dead in Iraq, where people were so angry about what I was doing, it was really quite wonderful to be involved in an experience where people were happy to see me and quite excited about what I was doing. When this project was over, I was invited to have an exhibition to document the experience at I-Beam's galleries, which in the Chelsea district in New York City. So I spent the next couple months essentially creating kind of documentation and artifacts from this experience. And one of the things I did was to use some open source software to extract my Gandhi avatar data from Second Life, which you can see here as it existed in Blender. That Blender file was eventually used as the basis for trying to recreate Gandhi as a papercraft sculpture using Pepakura Designer software from Japan. And this is a test. This is creating a Gandhi head. I then worked towards adapting the software, which most people use for making small, desktop-sized papercraft sculptures. But I wanted to make a large-scale monumental sculpture of Gandhi. So I started working in cardboard and translating this software to allow me to do that. And here's the result. What I created over a 6-week period of time of hard labor and kind of basic engineering, kind of figuring out how to get this to stand and be sturdy, is a 17-foot tall cardboard Gandhi I made him to be precisely the same height as Michelangelo's David in Florence, Italy. And for obvious reasons, David slaying Goliath from biblical mythology to Gandhi bringing down the British Empire and their control of India. So yeah, the work was really a kind of way to kind of physicalize, if you will, what was a very meaningful experience for me, and also very physical in terms of the use of my body, which was such a transformative experience. It's quite difficult to express, but I think this result actually effectively sort of shares some aspect of what that was like for me, and also to sort of bring the game space, bring the digital back into the analog, as I have with many of my works. Now, on the strength of that project, I was invited to be in an exhibition in Guangzhou, China, a triennial called Farewell Post-Colonialism. And they contacted me and they said, "We want to show your cardboard Gandhi." And I said, "Oh, that's awesome. He's in parts and pieces. We can box him up. He's very light. He's rather large, but yeah, we can send him over." And they said, "No, we don't want you to send him over. We want you to make another one." And at first I was like, "Oh my God, you've got to be kidding." But I went with it, and eventually went to China in the fall of 2008. And I worked with museum workers and volunteers, and we created a second cardboard Gandhi, which was included in this exhibition of over 170 artists, as I recall. At the time, this was the largest museum in China. Yeah, and this was amazing, and the response to the work was really quite rewarding as well. And it was also my first opportunity to go to China, which was fantastic. And based on curator experiencing Gandhi in China, I was invited to build a third one in Mechelen, Belgium, which I did in 2008 as well. Now, one of the things I did with Gandhi, when I was creating the treadmill and building Gandhi at iBeam in New York City, I was finding myself going online to websites like Instructables.com and various kind of how-to sites to find information on how to do basic things like turn a treadmill into a game controller, etc. So I thought, why not share the making of Gandhi on Instructables? And so I created an Instructables, and this is just kind of a part of sort of radical sharing of saying, hey, look, I did this. You can do something like it too. And this was, I think, probably the first example of a contemporary artist putting a how to make my artwork on Instructables. And it's very popular. This is, you can see 55,000 views as of July 2008. It's still up there. You can go take a look at it if you want and see any number of my works on there if you like. But this was a way of kind of sharing and sort of distributing this work that I found quite rewarding. And I actually know of two artists who now almost exclusively make cardboard work based on first seeing this project here. Some ongoing game work after doing these various projects. I remained really interested in kind of shooter games and kind of violence, and kind of examining the sort of modalities of play in terms of being a terrorist in various shooter games. If you were playing many of these games, 50% of the players online would be playing being a terrorist, and I thought, wow, that's really kind of strange. So I began to extract data from specifically the kind of terrorist other, the enemies within these game spaces, with the goal of creating kind of artifacts, kind of objects based on extracted object data. And this is one of the first ones that I did, these were called the Taliban hands. And I made these actually in Beijing on a residency. I was there for 3 months, working just south of the 798 district. So these were a pair of Taliban hands. If you put them together, it was a fighter holding a pistol. And I recreated these. These are almost a meter long each, and created out of a white corrugated plastic. Here you can see a close-up of one of these, and the works on the exhibition in Beijing after the end of the residency period. So this is the actual game that these Taliban hands came from, but I bring up this slide to just kind of show, this is the typical structure of these type of shooter games, right? If you're the enemy or the good guys, you each have a kind of similar equipment of weapons, and the potential for winning. It really is kind of balanced to create a sort of fair and equal kind of experience of play. Around this time, I had become really interested in America's utilization of unmanned aerial vehicles, or drones, in the wars in Afghanistan and otherwise, for the quote unquote war on terror. And I had an opportunity to receive a commission to create a new project. And what I proposed to do was to create a computer game. I've been doing all this work in games for so long, I thought maybe it's time I actually make a game. So I thought, what about making a game about drone warfare? And the issue with that, though, of course, is that that's a completely unbalanced experience of warfare that would be difficult to translate into play. Right? If you're the drone and the drone pilot, you have complete agency and control. If you're on the ground, as in this image, you have absolutely no agency and no control whatsoever. And the problem was, how do you turn this into an interesting experience of play? So what resulted was a project called Killbox, a game about drone warfare. I developed this with game developers in Dundee from the Biome Collective, and this was a not your typical experience of play. We were interested in creating a game that would examine and create a kind of difficult scenario in terms of exploring drone warfare as an instance of interactive play. So what we decided to do was to create a game space, a two-person player, where in one instance you would serve as the drone pilot and have this point of view looking down on a location in North Waziristan, Pakistan. Alternately, you would play as a kind of abstracted sort of symbolic child figure, this ball that would bounce around that same map. And this was actually a location that was based on an actual drone strike in North Waziristan, where a grandmother working in the fields was blown up in front of her family. Ideally, you would face off across a table or a similar installation space, or you can download this actually freely from Steam, by the way, and play this as a single person game. But what we set this up as was essentially that you would be facing the person who was either the drone pilot or the child, and you would go through this experience of play, which would involve an eventual drone strike and the death of the child on the ground. So once you went through this experience of play and the drone was launched and the child was killed, the game would stop and it would reboot, but the roles would switch. It would restart with the child playing from the drone pilot's point of view and the drone pilot playing from the child's point of view. So our intention was to create a kind of balanced experience of empathetic play. We did not design this to be fun, right? This is not let's go blow stuff up. It really created what we hoped was an impactful and meaningful experience of serious play. This was our kind of one of our first installations, and really kind of the way we do like to show this in kind of a darkened black box where you face off across a carefully designed kind of kiosk and go through those two experiences of play. So in the interim, while Killbox was being released, that was when I was recruited and hired to come to Abertay University. I was here and for about a year, and then got into making this new work. This is what you're looking at here is some information that informed the next project. This is some statistics from the Gun Violence Archive, which is a website that you can go to that in real time updates numbers of U.S. citizens killed via homicides, suicides, etc. And as you can see, in 2019, there were 15,208 deaths by guns, homicides. Suicides are generally about a half time larger than that. And there was that horrible shooting at Parkland, Florida, at the high school, where a whole number of students were killed by one of their fellow classmates armed with an assault rifle. And President Trump came out, and one of the things he said was that video games were to blame. And so this project, in a way, was a reaction to what he said, but also a larger reaction to the context of the insanity of gun violence in the United States. So I had this idea: could you utilize an existing shooter game to create a data visualization system of American gun violence? And so, and Grand Theft Auto. So I'd become more interested in this game, in part from moving to Dundee. Grand Theft Auto was first created here. Rockstar Games got its start here in Dundee. And kind of curious way it happened, where you had these Scottish-based game designers, most of whom had never been to the United States, created the original version of the game based on their experience of America from American film. But yeah, so it was really that came to play in what I made here. But more importantly, it was like, how could we turn this into a system where we visualized in real time gun violence from the United States? So what you are looking at, if you look at the screen here, you see a number at the bottom of the screen and a date. So that's July 12th, 2018. We launched the project July 4th, 2018. And essentially what this would do, we set this up to scrape the data from the gun violence archive as it changed, and to then sort of automatically play through a daily reenactment of all those gun violence totals since January 1st. So let me explain this, because it's important to understand. The game launches anew every midnight Central Time, USA, at 0, right? And it scrapes the data from the gun violence archive, which says since January 1st to this date, so many thousands of Americans have died. That number is then reenacted over the course of the day. So it's an accelerated death count for sure, but it's a data visualization, right? So by the end of the day at midnight, like on this date, there would have likely been over 7,000 deaths. By midnight of July 12th, 2018, it would have played through all of those deaths since January 1st across the 24-hour period. And then the next day it would reboot, and it would add in the numbers of homicides from the previous day, and so on. Now, in the video here that you're going to see, this is a recording of actual automated play. I forgot to mention that this was live streamed on Twitch 24/7 over the course of the 1 year running of this piece. It's received about 235,000 views. But you can see the action of the game in progress. And I should also mention the soundtrack is the first recording of this very famous American patriotic song called God Bless America. And I think it's becomes a bit self-explanatory in terms of its inclusion into the work. But I was really interested in kind of creating this sort of real-time kind of playback and sort of retreating from America as people kill each other, and with this hyper-patriotic music going in the background. It feels to me as though it's like the permanent ending of a film. This is probably the darkest work I've ever made. In some ways, it's about leaving the United States and moving to another country. I'm disgusted by the level of gun violence in the United States. It seems a retractable and impossible issue to solve, although there are solutions, of course. But it's also meant as a kind of memorial as well, a way of kind of recognizing the enormity of the costs of the sort of free access to really weapons that nobody actually really needs, not even for personal defense. So yeah, that's that work. Now, on a bit of a lighter side of things, this is jumping back to 1996. I was trained originally, before getting into digital systems, as an illustrator, as a graphic designer. So I do know how to paint, I do know how to draw. But in the first wave of virtual reality, I was really intrigued by these these kind of images to kind of sell and advertise and propagandize the virtual reality technologies. They really had a kind of curious kind of feeling to them that I wanted to reproduce using traditional media. So this is a large-scale painting, about 1.5 meters tall, from an image probably taken from Wired magazine and done in oil paint. I did a number of these images and really kind of, I think they're fairly successful, but one of the issues that I want to talk about is that I'm colorblind. So it's always been difficult for me to paint, right? Because I have a red-green deficiency, I can't see purple, pink looks gray, so it's very challenging for me to paint. I would always have to ask for help, what color is this, and then try to mix things appropriately. But it was never really a pleasing experience and something that I could really get into on a deep level. But I do think these images impart something quite interesting regardless. Another example of kind of early VR and the sort of interaction with which I just find these images fascinating. So yeah, recently in the United States, there's been the release of colorblind correcting glasses. And you might recall from my video intro at the start that I wear dark glasses, but these are colorblind correcting lenses. And I am now able to paint and able to actually see the colors that I'm working with. And this coincided with going to an event in New York City called FOST, the Future of Storytelling, a massive gathering of virtual reality experiences in 2018 that I was invited to attend. We actually showed Killbox at this festival. But it was so popular and so crowded that it was just very difficult to actually experience the VR. So I started taking photographs and decided, wow, maybe it's time to get back to painting. So I actually started doing small watercolors. These are about 10 inches wide, 10-inch square each, based on these photographs. So what you have here are essentially these analog documents of a very digital experience, right? We're not just looking at technology, we're actually inserting ourselves into it. We are immersing ourselves willingly into the box. Now, I don't know about any of you, but I grew up watching television with my mother yelling at us constantly not to sit so close to the television, right? And here we are actually inserting our bodies within the device. That, I think, is quite interesting in and of itself. It's very interesting, too, at this public setting for engaging VR, many people doing it for the first time. There were almost always minders, this other person who had to be there to keep you from walking into things or hurting yourself. Here's an example of one of the photographs that I would use as source material and the resulting painting. This is a group of people experiencing a music festival in Britain via virtual technologies. Here's two people who are in a connected space. This is where they are both playing individuals on a blind date and sitting next to each other very awkwardly on a sofa. So yeah, these are about capturing a moment in time and capturing people interacting with new technologies. I would suggest that these paintings will probably long outlast the very technology that it is depicting. These experiences will probably not be accessible 20, 30 years from now. These images might. This is actually a self-portrait of myself in a VR experience at Mass MoCA Museum in Massachusetts, where I was experiencing Laurie Anderson's VR work. Yeah, so I'm continuing this series. I mean, this is about 8 or 9 of these. I'm up to about 25. It's probably a bit of an offshoot of my work, but all of the work that I do is really about this kind of human experience and the meaning behind this technology, the good, the bad, and the ugly, if you will, and really, really trying to call into question how we utilize these devices, what we utilize them for, how they change us, how they change the world, from sort of personal use of technology such as this to operating on a geopolitical international stage. But that's the last image I have for you today. Thank you very much for experiencing my work, and you can always contact me if you have questions. I enjoy the Q&A with people from live lectures. This is, of course, a remote and recorded lecture. But thanks again for considering my work, and